The wind howled softly through the cemetery, rustling the fallen leaves scattered along the narrow path. A man dressed in a tailored black coat stood motionless in front of a white marble tombstone. His fingers traced the name etched into the cold stone, his heart heavy with sorrow. Richard Lawson, once a man who had everything, now felt like he had nothing. His wife, Eleanor, had been his world, and with her gone, even his vast fortune couldn't fill the emptiness inside him. He exhaled a shaky breath, placing a bouquet of white roses at the base of the grave. They were her favorite. Every week, without fail, he visited her, spoke to her as if she were still there, hoping the silence would answer back just once. But today, something was different. A quiet sob broke through the stillness of the cemetery. Richard turned his head slightly, his sharp eyes scanning the area. Near the adjacent graves, a small figure sat curled up, her shoulders trembling as she cried into her hands. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, her tiny frame swallowed up by an oversized tattered coat. Her feet were bare against the cold, hard ground, her hair tangled and unkempt. Richard hesitated for a moment. He wasn't the type to interfere in the lives of strangers, but something about the child's sorrow struck a chord deep inside him. Perhaps it was the way she clutched a small, faded photograph in her hands, as if it were the last precious thing she had in the world. Perhaps it was the way she looked so alone, much like he felt. Clearing his throat, he stepped closer. "Are you all right?" His voice, though gentle, startled the girl. She flinched, shrinking away from him, as if expecting to be scolded. Her wide, teary eyes darted up to meet his, and for a fleeting moment, he saw nothing but fear and desperation. I'm sorry," she stammered, wiping her eyes hastily. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." Richard crouched to her level, his gaze softening. "You're not bothering me," he said. "Are you lost?" She shook her head, gripping the photograph tighter. "No, I come here to see my mama." Her voice cracked on the last word, and fresh tears welled up in her eyes. Richard felt an ache in his chest. He glanced at the photograph she held so tightly. It was faded and creased from being held too often, but he could make out a smiling woman with warm eyes, holding a much younger version of the girl in her arms. The resemblance was undeniable. "Your mother," Richard began, but he didn't need to finish his sentence. The little girl gave a small nod, confirming what he already knew. "She's here," she whispered, glancing toward a modest headstone nearby. Unlike Eleanor's grand marble monument, this grave was simple, the name barely visible through the overgrown grass. Richard swallowed hard. "What's your name?" "Lily," he nodded. "Lily, do you have anyone looking after you?" She hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. Richard's mind raced. A girl so young, alone in a cemetery, clinging to memories of a mother she could never hold again. It was too much. He had come here to grieve, but now he found himself staring at someone who had lost even more than he had. Before he could ask another question, the wind picked up, and Lily shivered violently, pulling her thin coat tighter around her frail bodies. Without thinking, Richard slipped off his own scarf and wrapped it gently around her. She blinked up at him, surprised. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's get you somewhere warm." Lily hesitated again, but after a moment, nodded. As Richard helped her to her feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he never expected. But what he didn't know yet was that Lily was carrying a secret that would turn his entire world upside down. Richard led Lily out of the cemetery, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? How long had she been coming here alone? And more importantly, where? Would she go now? He had seen plenty of suffering in his lifetime, but there was something about the way Lily clung to that photograph, as if it were the only thing keeping her together, that unsettled him deeply. As they reached his car, he opened the door for her, half expecting her to hesitate. Instead, she climbed in without a word, wrapping the scarf he had given her tightly around her small frame. Richard turned on the heater, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. She looked exhausted, her eyelids heavy, but she fought to stay awake, as if afraid he might disappear if she closed her eyes. "Are you hungry?" he asked gently. She nodded. Minutes later, they pulled up in front of a quiet diner. The smell of warm bread and coffee filled the air as they stepped inside. Richard guided her to a booth in the corner, watching as she sat stiffly, her small hands resting on her lap. When the waitress arrived, he ordered a hot meal for both of them. Lily didn't speak much as she ate, but Richard noticed the way she glanced around the diner, watching the other customers, listening to the hum of conversation, as if she were trying to memorize every detail. "So, Lily," he began, keeping his voice light, "tell me about your mother." She paused, chewing slowly before setting her fork down. "She was kind," she said quietly. "She used to sing to me at night, even when she was tired." Her voice softened. She always smiled, even when things were hard. Richard swallowed. "And your father?" Her expression changed. A shadow passed over her small face, and she shook her head. "I don't know him." Something twisted in Richard's chest. "Did you live with anyone else?" She hesitated. "We had a small place, but after Mama got sick, we lost it." She glanced down at her plate. "After she was gone, I had nowhere to go." Richard felt his grip tighten around his coffee cup. "How long have you been alone?" Lily didn't answer right away. She traced patterns on the table with her fingertip, as if trying to find the right words. "A while," she admitted softly. A cold anger settled in Richard's chest. A child, alone, on the streets, visiting her mother's grave in a thin coat, with no one to protect her. It wasn't right. He had seen hardship before, had even faced his own share of loss, but this was different. Lily had no one. No family, no home, no warmth to return to, and yet something about her was familiar. Richard's mind drifted back to Eleanor. He had spent years mourning her loss, drowning himself in work to escape the pain. But what if, just once, he had been looking in the wrong place for meaning? Lily yawned suddenly, her small body slumping against the booth. Richard watched as she blinked sleepily, fighting to stay awake. "You're safe now," he told her gently. "Get some rest." She hesitated, looking at him as if she wasn't sure whether to believe him. But exhaustion won, and before long, her head rested against the table, her breathing steady. Richard sat there in silence, watching the rain trickle down the window outside. He had walked into the cemetery, expecting another lonely visit to Eleanor's grave. But now, sitting across from a sleeping child who had lost everything, he realized something. This wasn't a coincidence. Something bigger was at play, and he was going to find out what. Richard sat there for a long time, watching Lily sleep. The rain outside tapped softly against the window, and the low hum of conversation in the diner made the moment feel strangely calm. But inside, his mind was anything but still. Something about this little girl, about her sorrow, about the way she looked at him. It tugged at something deep within him, something he couldn't quite name. He didn't know why, but he felt responsible for her, and not just in the way any decent person would feel for a child in need. No, this was different. It was personal. When the waitress came by, Richard paid for their meal and gently shook Lily's shoulder. She stirred, blinking up at him with tired eyes. "Let's go," he said softly. Back in the car, Lily clutched his scarf around herself, staring out the window. The city lights blurred in the rain, casting shadows over the streets. Richard wasn't sure what he was doing or where he was taking her. He just knew he couldn't leave her out there alone. "Lily," he said, keeping his voice steady, "do you remember anything about your father?" She hesitated. "Mama never talked about him much," she murmured. "But one time, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her say his name." Richard's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What was it?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Richard." His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. The sounds of the city, the rain, even the beating of his own heart, all of it faded into silence. He turned to look at her, his hands suddenly cold. "Lily, your mother's name. Tell me again." She frowned slightly, as if confused by his reaction. "Eleanor." The breath left his lungs. Everything clicked into place at once. The strange familiarity he had felt, the ache in his chest when he saw her, the way she reminded him of someone he had loved more than anything in the world. Lily was his daughter. His heart pounded as the weight of the realization settled over him. Eleanor had never told him. She had been pregnant when she left. She had raised Lily alone, suffered alone, and when she passed, their child had been left with nothing. His child. "Lily," he whispered, his voice shaking. I think I'm your father." She stared at him, her eyes wide. "You?" Richard nodded, his throat tight. He had spent years mourning Eleanor, convinced that he had lost everything when she died. But now, sitting next to this little girl, his daughter, he realized he had been wrong. Tears welled up in Lily's eyes. But this time, they weren't just from sadness. There was something else. Hope, maybe, or the fragile beginnings of trust. "Are you gonna leave me too?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard swallowed hard. "Never," he promised, and, for the first time in a long time, he knew he had something to live for again.